What is a toilet paper roll doing on this cake channel? Have no fear, guys. It's just a cake. Yep, I said it. It is a cake. Hi guys, welcome back. Today I want to show us how I was able to make this toilet paper cake. This design was inspired by my student who said she wanted to try something quite silly, a cake design that's quite hilarious, and we decided to make a toilet paper cake. And in this video I am going to show you guys how we were able to make this. So we started off by crumb coating a 6-inch vanilla and strawberry cake, layered, trimmed, and I'm putting a thin layer of butter icing on it just to seal off the crumbs so it doesn't mess with the final design of the fondant that we're going to place on the cake. I apply the butter icing and then I use a scraper to take off the excess from the cake, making sure everything is nice and leveled. I use my spatula to finish off the top. We just want to make sure that this baby is well leveled and prepared for the fondant stage. I run the spatula at the edge of the cake just to make sure that everything is nice and layered. I use my cookie cutter, the smallest one actually, to cut in a hole in the middle of the cake. This hole is the hole that we actually the center of the toilet paper roll. So I cut it out and then I use my spatula to take out the remaining chunks that I couldn't take out with the cookie cutter. And once I do this, I'm going to apply some butter icing in the center just to seal up the crumbs. We don't actually need to put in too much butter icing in here. We just have to put just enough to seal in the crumbs. In the center, I'm going to be placing a piece of fondant that I dyed gray. It's actually gray, not black. I know it looks like black because of the discoloration from the video, but it's actually a dark shade of gray. So I dyed it and then I'm placing it in the center. I'm using my fingers to smoothen it all out, and then I cut off the excess because we won't be needing that excess, so I'm cutting it out. Then I smoothen it just to make sure it fits in perfectly. I measure the circumference of my cake and then I take measurements of the length just so I know how much fondant that I need to cut out. Now I cut out the fondant and then I looked for something to make the toilet paper impression on the fondant, and the nearest thing I could find was my flour sifter, so I used it to create the toilet paper impression on the fondant, just like you're seeing in the video right now. I cut out a circular piece of fondant, used the cookie cutter, made a hole in the center, and I placed it on top. You make sure that the hole matches the one on the cake, so you'll be able to get the center of the toilet paper roll. And then I place it on the cake. I smoothen it all, use a fondant smoother to make sure that it stays nicely on the cake. I'm using a paneling method to make this cake, so I'm going to flip my cake. Yeah, I just flipped it, and then I'm going to place the next roll of fondant around the body, which I had already measured. I placed a paper towel on the board that I put the cake on, just so the board doesn't dent my white fondant, gives it another color. So if you're using another board, try to place something there so that it doesn't actually discolor the fondant. So I cut the excess fondant from the places where the edges of the fondant meets. It's going to form a seam, so I gently press it together to make sure that they come closer. I use a fondant smoother to do this. I'm pressing gently, just enough pressure to bring everything together. And this is why you have to cut your fondant to be a little thick, so that when you're pressing them together, it doesn't become so thin and starts to tear. So I'm using my crafting knife to cut off the excess fondant from the top of the cake. We don't need the excess, so I'm smoothing out everything, pressing it, giving it a little pressure just to make sure everything is nice and smooth. I actually had to use 2 fondant smoothers here. I'm trying to get the seam to meet each other to a point where it's not so noticeable anymore. So I trim off the excess fondant, making it flush to the cake. Then I'm going to use my fondant smoother to press the fondant down. I'm doing it so that both fondant meet, the one on top and the one on the body. Everything meets together so that it's nice and firm together before I can trim off the excess on the edge of the fondant, as you can see on the edge of the cake. So I'm doing this, pressing it together. Everything is now even, so I'm using my crafting knife to trim off the excesses. I am careful when I'm trimming so I don't cut in deep into the cake. So I'm going to flip it over again, and then I'm going to use the 2 smoothers. I place one on top, and then I use the one in my other hand to run it around the cake, pressing it. I'm doing this to give the edges a sharper look, bringing everything together to a neat finishing. So guys, you can't actually do without using 2 fondants in this cake, so I advise you stock up your pantry with 2 fondants. It's quite important. So I'm trying to give this cake a final finishing to make everything look smooth. I'm using my crafting knife to cut off the excess, making sure that I'm cutting it at a leveled pace. Everything is leveled and nice, and then I'm going to use the smoother to run it through again. Then I use my overstitch tool to make lines and markings where the toilet paper roll is being, when you want to tear out a sheet from your toilet paper. I used one of my nozzle. I used the tip to make indentions on the toilet paper. Most toilet papers come with some sort of indentation. I couldn't find the exact one, so I had to improvise, and I think I liked the design it gave on this cake. It actually made it much more realistic, and it's quite cute. I wanted to make the toilet paper look much more realistic, so I brought my cookie cutters, all of the shapes, all of the sizes, and I placed it on top just to make indentions on the top, so it looks like it's actually a roll of toilet paper. So I'm giving it a marking, pressing it so it gives the indentation, but not too hard so the cake doesn't tear. Now the indentation I gave wasn't enough, so I used my embosser tool to finish up the places that I couldn't get with the cookie cutter. You don't actually have to make this so perfect circle, but just to make sure that you give it a realistic look, emboss the lines. I do this until I'm quite satisfied with the way it looks, and then we'll move to the next part of the decoration. This was actually the most fun part of this whole decoration process. So I kind of, did it for quite a long time, trying to run my buzzer tool around the toilet paper cake. I added a little bit of Tylose powder to this particular piece of fondant that I'm cutting out. I roll it out quite thin, and then I cut it to a square and I give the impression on it too, so it looks like the rest of the cake. I apply a little bit of water to the seam of the fondant, the place where the two fondants meet, so it can cover it up, and then I placed this strip of fondant on that part. This is actually the part where the toilet paper is being torn out from. I also made the indentions with the nozzle just like the rest of the cake body. I did the same thing to this particular side, and I'm using a little bit of water here and there to stick it properly to the cake, and then I'm placing the paper towel there so that it can hold it till it dries and sets and it's firm enough to just stand on its own and look realistic. So I do this, I glue it up, and then I place the paper towel there and allow it to set and firm up on its own. I'm going to use the overstitch tool to also run a line straight up on this to make it look more realistic, like a part of the toilet paper where you just tear out the sheets from, something like that. Yep, and that's it. It looks better now. I leave it to dry and voila, our cake is done. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you liked this video. Give it a thumbs up, leave a comment for me below if there's any other thing you might want me to make in a cake, and I'll be sure to do it for you. Yep, that's it for today. I'll see you guys next week while I allow my student have a bite of her cake. Goodbye.